evening, everyone, and welcome. I will begin with the basic housekeeping items. Bathrooms are behind you along the wall. Refreshments are in the lobby, and feel free to get up and get anything you need at any time. I must thank the folks who brought this event together, beginning with Stacy Fresher and Kay Higgins from Defeat Scott Swamp Development. John Correa with the Pequabic River Watershed Association. Carol Noble, retired from the City of Bristol as an environmental engineer and certified floodplain manager. Thank you, folks, for helping to bring this together. I also want to thank a volunteer with Nutmeg TV, Bill Majak, who is just amazing and giving of his time to film this for us. Thank you, Bill Majak. My name is Mary Ridings-Ward. I am the president of the Pequabic River Watershed Association. PRWA is sponsoring today's event to bring you more information on how we can create a healthy and sustainable home for humans here on Earth. Air pollution and water pollution know no bounds, cycling around this globe we all call home. The good news is we really can act locally to make a difference globally. The PRWA works to create a healthy community here in our watershed. We hope you will join us with your membership and/or effort to educate the public about the immense value of an undisturbed Scott Swamp. Representatives from the group aiming to defeat the proposed Scott Swamp development are here today, and if you haven't already, take a moment and talk with them. Tonight we are fortunate to have speaking to us one of Connecticut's leading experts in the conservation of our state's reptiles and amphibians, Dennis Quinn. Dennis's career has been dedicated to salamanders, frogs, and toads, turtles, and snakes and lizards. Along with his field work and study of these animals, Dennis is a nature and wildlife photographer. Earlier in his career, Dennis was rambling around Farmington and several nearby towns as field biologist for the Farmington Valley Biodiversity Study. The study was sponsored by Dr. Michael Clemens, a conservation biologist who works at the interdisciplinary interface between science, land use decision-making, and public policy. This study was under the direction of noted herpetologist Hank Gruner, who, by the way, grew up in Bristol. Tonight, Dennis will share useful knowledge to help us understand better how to protect our local reptiles and amphibians so that we might create a healthier planet for all. Sharing his knowledge and enthusiasm for salamanders, turtles, and snakes, please welcome Dennis Quinn.
I can't right now. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. This is such a great turnout, everyone, here on a Wednesday evening to listen to me speak about the conservation of Connecticut's amphibians and reptiles. It's really great to see everyone. One of the things that I always look at when I first do a site assessment is look at the demographics of a population. That tells you a lot about how healthy your ecosystem is and how healthy the species within your ecosystems are. And I have to tell you, I've never seen a crowd that I've talked with as diverse as this crowd is tonight. So give yourselves a round of applause. This is what we need. We absolutely need more of this. We need interest from all age groups across the board to affect conservation in the state of Connecticut, both locally, regionally, statewide, and throughout the region. So again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. My name is Dennis Quinn. I'm the owner of Quinn Ecological, which is a small environmental consulting company that specializes on the conservation and preservation of Connecticut's amphibians and reptiles. I've been working as a herpetologist here in the state of Connecticut for over 20 years now. time flies, I guess. It's funny when we mentioned the Farmington River Biodiversity Study. That was one of the first projects I ever worked on as a herpetologist. I was hired right out of Central Connecticut State University to work on that project with Hank Gruner. But currently, I own an environmental consulting company. I do consulting for the state of Connecticut, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, private organizations, not-for-profits across the board. But I also work for-profit organizations and, believe it or not, developers. Sorry. So we're going to talk about it all today. It's okay. We're going to get into it. I've kind of set this presentation up a little bit different than I typically do. So I hope that it works out. It's a new talk for me, and we'll see how it goes. One other thing I wanted to mention is that I'm one of the co-authors, and two of the others were mentioned, Dr. Michael Clemens and Hank Gruner, on the conservation of amphibians and reptiles in Connecticut. So everything that we're talking about here tonight is published in this book. This book is the first book that's ever been put out to comprehensively dive into the issues surrounding conservation of amphibians and reptiles in Connecticut. It's not only applicable to Connecticut, and it's not only applicable to amphibians and reptiles. It works with all taxons, and it works across New England. So I would strongly suggest picking this up if you're a conservation guru and want to learn more about the conservation of the amphibians and reptiles. I will say this, I am not promoting myself. I am not gaining any money by the sales of this book. This book was written from a grant from the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. I received no funds to write this. It was a labor of love for 5 years that basically details the entire career of myself and all of my colleagues. All proceeds from this book go directly into the conservation and management of amphibians and reptiles in Connecticut. So let's get into it. So I think that will be my cue. We're going to start the PowerPoint presentation now. I've never given a talk with so many things in my hands either. This is going to get very awkward for me, believe me. So, salamanders, turtles, and snakes, oh my, we forgot the frogs, but we'll get to them. Does anyone know what this species is? Go ahead. This is a salamander. Does anyone know what type of salamander it is? Close enough. It's a spotted salamander. This is one of our salamanders that we see migrating during the early spring months, moving across forested landscapes into their breeding habitats, which are vernal pools. This is the spotted salamander. And you can see this female here is actually in the process of depositing her eggs inside of a vernal pool. This photo took a long time to get, but I think it was well worth it, and now I start many of my presentations with it. So let's get into this a little bit. That's the volume button. That's the wrong button. And here we are. So I want to give a quick overview of the book, because the book does really outline why we're here tonight, the conservation of amphibians and reptiles in Connecticut. And again, my co-authors, Dr. Michael Clemens, Hank Gruner, Eric Davison. So why did we do a revision of Dr. Clemens' book from 1993, Amphibians and Reptiles of Connecticut and Adjacent Regions? This is what is often referred to as the Bible for the amphibians and reptiles in Connecticut. Why did we do a revision? Well, simply, we have 45 plus years of data documenting the distribution of the species in Connecticut. That may not seem like a lot, but when it comes down to it, Connecticut has the most diverse and comprehensive database in all of the United States when it comes to the distribution of their amphibians and reptiles. So we know where our species are, and you're going to find that we've also done a ton of work on a lot of our species, and we know what needs to be done to effectively conserve these species in Connecticut. So the question is, why are we failing at that process? Why are we not successfully conserving these species in Connecticut today? I never said this was going to be a happy presentation. So there's also an increasing complexity and urgency of conservation challenges here in the state right now, within the ecological, scientific, and especially within the policy arenas. So these are very important things to understand. We wanted to take a new approach to the understanding of the drivers that cause decline in amphibians and reptiles across the state. So we're going to be talking quite a bit about that and some of the actions that we can do to address some of these conservation challenges. This box turtle is going to drive me crazy by the end of this. If you guys hear that turtle, that's the box turtle trying to get out of his house. So, in order to understand the challenges that we face when it comes to conservation, we really have to understand a couple of foundational concepts. Number one, species have biological and ecological constraints, meaning they're tied to certain habitats, and they're tied to those habitats because they need to be in order to fulfill their physiological needs within the ecosystem. The second part of this is that species and populations have anthropogenic stressors acting on them. When it comes to conservation, we really need to look at the synergistic effects and the interplay between A and B to effectively conserve these animals. To do this, this book outlines a new approach to conservation. We take a guild approach. Previously, most works would focus on a single species or a single habitat and how to preserve that one species or that one habitat. We all know that funding is limited, resources are limited in this day and age, and quite frankly, so is time. We don't have much time left to act. So we need to take a different approach on the conservation challenges, and by doing that, by doing this guild approach, grouping organisms together, grouping those organisms which face similar challenges, we can achieve greater conservation initiatives in the end. So we're also going to talk a little bit about the critical roles of stakeholders, especially municipal governments. I think it's often thought that most conservation in the state of Connecticut is done by the state of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. That is simply not the case. The majority of conservation in Connecticut is in your hands. It's in the local municipalities. Does anyone know how many towns are in Connecticut?
36.
Close. I think I'll just say it. 169 towns. Whoa, no way. 169 towns. Now, that's a pretty impressive number, right? You know what's even more impressive? They all have different regulations when it comes to the protection of species. So there's a little bit of a complication there. All right, so when we understand species and conservation challenges, we need to understand species are not equally vulnerable to environmental or anthropogenic stressors, okay? So we have two species here, the eastern garter snake and the ribbon snake. Some of you might be saying, well, it's the common ribbon snake. That's the name of this species. I personally do not use the epithet common because it gives a false sense of security for that species. This species is far from common. It's actually a threatened or a special concern species in Connecticut and declining across its Connecticut range. No, they're not venomous. They're completely harmless. If they were to bite you, you wouldn't even bleed. So we have two species of snake within the same genus. One, the eastern garter snake, super common, found in probably most of your backyards, across the landscape, forested habitats, wetland habitats, feeds on basically everything that it can fit into its mouth, insects, amphibians, other snakes sometimes. This species is a generalist species in nature. Because it's a generalist, it doesn't have any specific habitat requirements, it doesn't have any specific food requirements. It can just move throughout the ecosystem and sustain itself basically wherever it is. As long as it's not getting run over by lawnmowers or vehicles, it's doing pretty well for itself. But a very similarly related species, the ribbon snake, is a habitat, not a specialist, but it's almost a habitat specialist in the sense that it depends on early successional habitats and habitat mosaics. What does this term habitat mosaics mean? This means you need a variety of different habitats unfragmented from each other within an area for this species to survive. So this species not only depends heavily on terrestrial early successional habitats, it depends heavily on wetland early successional habitats, forested wetlands, dry uplands and forested habitats, a variety of different habitats. It needs all of those habitats to be able to go through its specialized life cycle throughout the season and its very specific feeding strategies that it uses throughout the season. So it's a much more specialized species than the common garter snake is, or the eastern garter snake is. And because of that, the threats that we impose on it in our environment are felt to a much greater extent in that species than they are the garter snake.
Can you keep them as pets?
What was that?
Can you keep them as pets?
I would recommend you not keep anything that's native as a pet. Garter snakes wouldn't make a good pet anyway, but you want to keep them wild. Keep them in the wild where they belong is the best thing to do.
No, like if you adopt them from a pet store.
Well, I don't think pet stores adopt animals, but if you had to adopt a snake, you could potentially adopt a snake that would make a good pet, but I recommend not keeping them as pets. It's usually better. Yeah. One more question.
I went to this place by and then there's a garden snake, and it was off in the door, and off in the door, and it happened.
That's very good. That's what we should be doing, saving our snakes when they need our help. So, if we look at this list of species, these are the ones that would sort of be comparable to the garter snake. These are species that we consider common throughout the state, very widespread, don't rely on a lot of significant habitats or anything like that. So, these are very common species throughout the state. Now, let's get into some of the conservation guilds. This is where it gets really important. We have 4 conservation guilds. 3 of those guilds are habitat associated, and one of those is it's associated with reproductive life histories. So we have species that are first dependent on rare habitats, species that are dependent on early successional habitats, and species that are dependent on habitat mosaics. But we also have species in Connecticut that are long-lived, with delayed sexual maturity, and have low fecundity. What does this mean? It means they live for a very long time. This wood turtle can live up to 75 plus years. It's delayed time to reaching sexual maturity, sometimes as long as 15 years in Connecticut. And low fecundity, meaning it lays few eggs, and few of those eggs actually survive, and juveniles actually reach adulthood. So that's what low fecundity means. If we look at some of our species that are dependent on rare habitat, we have species such as spring salamanders. These are dependent on headwater streams in the northern reaches of Connecticut, high elevation, very cold, cool, highly oxygenated waters. If we look at a species such as the mud puppy, does anyone even know we had a mud puppy? We have a mud puppy, which is the only fully aquatic salamander that we have in Connecticut. It's almost. This is a mud puppy. They live in the Connecticut River and the Farmington River. So in the Connecticut River, Farmington River, which is a tributary of the Connecticut River, but also the Housatonic River. So they live in 2 major drainage basins in the state of Connecticut.
Why does that turtle look menacing?
It is menacing. And then we have species such as the slimy salamander, which require core forest. This is something I don't hear enough about, the impacts that core forest faces in Connecticut. Bog turtles, another specialized species, which requires fen-type habitats. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. And then, of course, our diamondback terrapin, which is our only species that is restricted to a coastal distribution where it lives in tidal marshes and creeks. Our second guild is our species that depend on early successional habitats. This isn't all of them, but this is a representative sample of them. We have northern leopard frogs, Fowler's toads, smooth green snakes, and 5-line skinks. One of the things that you may notice is that when we're talking about species that are dependent on early successional habitats, we need to wrap our heads around the idea that there's not only one type of early successional habitat. We have floodplain early successional habitats. We have these old abandoned scarified habitats, which are typically from old mining operations, things like that. We also have ridge tops, these bedrock outcroppings that we have across the central part of the state and the western part of the state. These are critical habitats if they are remained open for some of these species. And then, of course, our traditional early successional habitat is our early successional fields, composed of primarily flowering plant species. This is the one we're going to talk about the most today, and we're going to see why in just a little bit. This is the third Conservation Guild 3, habitat mosaic dependent species. These are the species that require multiple habitats to complete their annual life cycle, if you can say. So they're natural history traits. So we have our classic examples like our mole salamanders, blue spotted salamander, Jefferson salamander, our wood frog, and of course our spotted turtle. There are many more, but these are some of the classic examples where these species require a multitude of habitats throughout the season. If we take, for example, the wood frog, we know that during the early spring months, wood frogs migrate into vernal pools. Vernal pools are seasonal depressions or seasonal wetlands where they deposit their egg masses. Those egg masses will hatch. The larvae will develop in that pool, and then as the pool dries into like June or July, they will metamorphose into little froglets and leave that pool. The thing to remember is that, a couple things to remember. One is a vernal pool is a regulatory body of water, so it is regulated, right? So we do have some protections for it. What we lack is what's even not more important, but equally as important, is the upland surrounding the vernal pool. That's the habitat that these spend the majority of their time in throughout the late spring, summer, and fall months, and even the winter. They hibernate in the upland habitats surrounding these breeding wetlands. Wood frogs can move distances of over 3,000 feet, 3,000 feet from a breeding wetland. So when we start to fragment the landscape with developments and roads, we really begin to impact these populations and the sustainable numbers required to promote healthy populations of wood frogs. I'm not going to go through all of these. Maybe if I will.
Can I ask a question?
Someone says that. Yes, go ahead.
Could you back to the last slide?
Yeah.
So since you were from Central, you know the Stanley Quarter Park?
I do know Stanley
Yes,
Quarter
that
Park,
pond
yes.
there. It was recently had like an algae bloom,
Algal,
so they had
yeah.
to like empty the whole thing and bring it back. So like I know for sure there was tons of frogs and spotted turtles there.
Yep.
So is there a way for like, would you? I know for sure that a lot of them died when that happened because I did not see anything that looked like it would remotely help them. So like, what could be different?
What would you do in that circumstance? The first thing I would do is Stanley Quarter Park is an urbanized pond. It needs to have an aerator in it. That would be number one. That would prevent a lot of the problems that they have there from happening. But a lot of the species that live in that are what we refer to as our common species. So our painted turtles, green frogs, bullfrogs, you might get a snapping turtle or two in those ponds. Those are the ones that can respond to urbanized landscapes pretty well. So that impact, although on the surface it looks terrible, globally it's not that big of a deal. They'll recover, the pond will recover, more snapping turtles will come into it, more painted turtles will migrate into it, it'll be fine. It's really these more specialized species that can't respond to things like that, and we're going to get more into that in just a second. But if we take another example of habitat mosaics and how a spotted turtle uses the landscape, it's kind of impressive. So if we start here at A, early spring, we're talking late February, early March. We're just starting to see skunk cabbages grow and the buds come out on some of our red maple trees, right? You will see spotted turtles coming out of these shrub swamps where they spent the winter hibernating. They tend to spend winters in shrub swamps where they hibernate, sometimes communally, in the root masses of the emergent shrub vegetation within these systems. And when I talk about emergent vegetation, I'm talking about vegetation that is rooted in the wetland itself and then shoots sticks and leaves out of the water to emerge out of the water. So that's emergent vegetation. We have emergent and submergent vegetation. So these spotted turtles will stay in there, they'll hibernate, But once they come out, they don't just stay there. They don't stay there very long. What also happens in the early spring? We just talked about it in around March. What happens? We just did a whole slide on him, the wood turtle, right? The wood frog, right? So he comes down into the pool, he lays his eggs, his tadpoles, the eggs hatch into little tadpoles. Well, that, the spotted turtle knows. He is keyed into that. So this spotted turtle, which was way down in here, will transverse the landscape all the way over to B, this letter up here. And why is it going up there? That is a vernal pool on the landscape, okay? It's going there because it has optimal feeding opportunity at this site. So that's why it's moving that far across the landscape, because it has optimal feeding opportunities. And it's feeding on all the larvae and egg masses from the amphibians that bred in the vernal pool in the spring. Now, it doesn't stop there either, because vernal pools will eventually dry out, so that food source will eventually go away. So they will split up and go into different wetlands across the landscape as well. But we're going to follow the life cycle of a female turtle. So our female turtles, right around the first week of June, will migrate out of these pools and make their way across the landscape again, usually into an early successional field or a more of a sandy area that doesn't have much vegetation on the landscape. And why are they doing that? That's where they're depositing their eggs. Remember, all turtles have to deposit their eggs in a terrestrial ecosystem. It doesn't matter if you're a painted turtle, snapping turtle, sea turtle, or a bog turtle. You have to get into some sort of a terrestrial habitat where your eggs will not be exposed to water, because if the eggs are exposed to water, they'll eventually drown. So your eggs are laid on land, they're buried underground. You can see this female burying her eggs underground, and then she just gets up and leaves them and they're fine. That's not the issue, right? Then, once she's done laying her eggs, she moves again. What is she doing up here in the forest? This is very strange activity for a turtle, right? We wouldn't think that it would now move way up into the forest. Well, this is what they do, especially on very hot, dry seasons. Not this year. They didn't do this year. But next year, if it's very hot and dry, they will do this. What they're doing is they're estivating. Estivation is very similar to brumation. Brumation is like hibernation. This is where they take a summertime nap. They dig themselves down into the leaf litter of the forest, and that's because that's a place they can stay very cool and very moist to wait out the very dry, hot conditions of the summer. Then they wake up from their summer nap. I wish I could take a summer nap. And then they move to E, which is right back into the shrub swamp that they originated from. So we could see this whole entire loop throughout the season as this turtle moves across the landscape. This is critical. This is what we need to be looking at. Landscape scale ecology and conservation and protection of species. Understanding the individual life cycles of these species to be able to accommodate them in their life cycles and not impact them through developmental processes. So for example, if we were to put a road right down through here, we can do it and not be in any violation. It could happen. It has happened many times in Connecticut. But we could put a road in here and there wouldn't be any issue. The only issue would be for the turtles, right? We would have completely fragmented their landscape. Not only that, we would have fragmented the landscape of all the spotted salamanders, marbled salamanders, potentially blue-spotted or Jefferson salamanders using this vernal pool, which are also using these surrounding uplands for most of the summer months after that. This is critical to understand. Species do not stay in one area for their entire season. They are like sheets of water across the landscape. They move like a sheet of water across the landscape, and we need to protect that landscape and leave as few barriers to their dispersal as possible in order to appropriately protect them. All right, this is where things are going to get real boring, guys, because now we're going to really talk about conservation. This microphone is real heavy. All right, we do have one more conservation guild, which I'm just going to go through really quick. I don't want to talk about it too much, but it is important to understand it. That's Conservation Guild 4, where we have our long-lived, delayed sexual maturity and low fecundity. And for these folks in the front row that were wondering about venomous snakes, that's one of them. That's a timber rattlesnake. That's one of the 2 venomous species that we have in Connecticut, the timber rattlesnake, and of course the second one is the eastern copperhead. But if we look at something like the timber rattlesnake in comparison to the wood turtle, which are both long-lived species, the timber rattlesnake can live up to 30 plus years, 75 plus years for the wood turtle. Think about that. How many people in this room are 75 years or older? 2. If you were a turtle, you wouldn't be here tonight. Okay? Think about this. The time it takes for a turtle to reach sexual maturity or a rattlesnake to reach sexual maturity is 10 years. A wood turtle up to 14, 15 sometimes, and sometimes longer for a timber rattlesnake. How often are these species reproducing? Well, timber rattlesnakes are really, really infrequent. They only lay, they're live-bearing, they don't lay eggs. They only give birth every 3 to 4 years. It takes so much energy for a timber rattlesnake to give birth that they only do it every 3 to 4 years. And when they do that, they only on average have between 6 and 9 young. Very small litters when it comes to reproductive output. So when we're talking about long-lived species, it's not a joke. They are dependent on their long lives to sustain their populations because their breeding strategy is not to be successful every single year. It's to be dotted with success over time. It's that one that survives once a year or every other year that reaches it to adulthood. That's what's sustainable for a long-lived turtle or a long-lived species. So if we think about our turtles, think about our wood turtle, they do reproduce annually, 7 to 9 offspring, and then that baby takes 12 to 14 years to reach sexual maturity. If we think about that in the long term and a breeding strategy, the loss of just a single wood turtle, box turtle, any of these long-lived species from a population once a year is a net decline over time, which will eventually lead to the extirpation of a population. One, the loss of a single individual. If you lose a male, it's not as drastic. You really don't want the females being killed. Now, unfortunately, when we talk about turtles, what did we discuss before? The female was making a large movement across the landscape, right, to reach that nesting area. They're the ones that often come into contact with people more so than the male individuals. And they're the ones that are typically getting killed at a higher rate than the males. Okay? So we are losing our females at a greater rate than we are losing our males, unfortunately, which is not sustainable. I told everyone in the beginning, one of the first things I do is I look at the demographics of a population to gauge sustainability of that population. And I want to see good, strong numbers. I want to see juveniles, hatchlings, middle-aged, older individuals. But I also want to see about 50-50 sex ratios, male to female. Okay? If I'm seeing skewed sex ratios, that tells me a lot about the population, and it also tells me a lot of what the potential impacts are. If I'm seeing a lot of females or a lot of males, but not a lot of females, that's telling me something's preventing females from getting back from their nesting movements. They're probably getting killed somewhere along that pathway getting to and from nesting habitats. If I'm getting a lot of males, that's telling me something completely different. And you probably want to know what, but I'm not going to give away that secret tonight because we have to move on. I don't have all night to talk about this. So if we look at the reptiles and amphibians in Connecticut that are actually placed in guilds, these are them. There's 27 uncommon species with a restricted Connecticut distribution. 27, okay? That's a lot. One thing that's extremely important to understand is that we've talked about, to this point, these guilds individually. Rare habitat, early successional dependent, mosaic habitat dependent. If you are an unfortunate species that is in multiple guilds, for example, this Fowler's toad, it's an early successional dependent species and a habitat mosaic dependent species, you now face the conservation challenges associated with both of these guilds. So you face compounding impacts from these stressors that are associated with each of these gills. Does that make sense? You don't want to be a bog turtle. You don't want to be a box turtle in this day and age. This is getting spooky. It's Halloween. I think I had a question in the back. No. Oh, great. Okay, that concludes the presentation on our species. This is another critical thing that we need to understand as communities if we're going to promote successful conservation practices. You need to understand where you are in the state, okay? Connecticut's landscape is not uniform, right? The distribution of species is not uniform. That's something we need to understand. A lot of people think species are distributed in this uniform fashion across the state. They are not. The distribution of species is influenced by the biogeography, geology, elevation, regional climate, and land use practices throughout the state, okay? This is a very important concept to understand, so I want to illustrate it just a little bit. If we take, for example, the slimy salamander. The slimy salamander is at its northeastern range limit here in the state of Connecticut. So if we look at its range throughout the eastern half of the United States, it just makes it into the northeastern portion of Connecticut. And the portion of Connecticut that it makes it into is where this little tiny bit of the Hudson Highlands comes into the state. So this is the geological formation that supports this species here in Connecticut. And again, it's a good example of biogeography because its distribution in the state is limited because of the geology, but also the fact that it's a northeastern range limit species. This species in Connecticut is highly restricted to core forest, very specialized microhabitats within those patches of core forest, and it behaves different in Connecticut. Completely different in Connecticut. If you were to drive just 45 minutes outside of Connecticut on a good day without traffic and cross the Hudson River, slimy salamanders would be everywhere. Everywhere. In open canopied habitats, on the roadsides, along power line easements, they would be found everywhere. Not the case in Connecticut. In Connecticut, they are highly restricted to very specialized habitat patches within the extreme western portion of the state, within, even more extreme, just the Hudson Highlands region of the state. So know where you are. Why is this important? Think about yourself as a town manager or a town planner or a conservation commission. Why is this important? If you live down here in Madison, do you need to be thinking about slimy salamanders? No. But if you live here in Danbury, New Fairfield, Sherman, New Milford, Brookfield, you have, to the state of Connecticut, a regional responsibility to up your efforts in the protection of this species. Not just because you're the only towns where this species occurs in Connecticut, but you're also at the limit of this species' range nationally. Nationally. And range limit species always have very unique genetics. They're always the best survivors within a population. We're not talking about the standard genetics of these ones down here. We're talking about highly specialized genetics within these peripheral range species. So you as a potential land use decision maker have a regional responsibility to not just Connecticut, but the slimy salamander as a whole throughout its geographical range in the United States. Okay? This is important to know. It's critically important. Every town in Connecticut has some sort of regional responsibility. Where we are today, we don't have any responsibility to the slimy salamander. But that's not the point. I'm hitting the wrong button. But that's important to understand, okay? Let's do another one. Example of geology, marble bedrock, right? Does anyone know what this species is? Let me start again. How many of you guys have heard of elephants? How many of you guys have heard of black rhinos? Come on, I know everybody in this room has heard of elephants and black rhinos. How many of you have heard of the bog turtle? No, you haven't. You guys are fibbing. You guys are fibbing. All right. This bog turtle has the same UCIN listing as a rhino and an elephant. Why do you guys not know about it when it lives in your own backyard? Why? Why? This is just as rare, if not more rare. We will lose this turtle potentially in my lifetime in this state. We have lost over 50% of these turtles in this state since I've been a herpetologist. It hasn't been that long. I know I'm probably old to you guys, but I'm very young to them. So if we look at this right here, forget this, Pop. See this one right here? That's gone. This is an old map. These red dots represent documented populations of the bog turtle throughout the state of Connecticut. And where does the bog turtle live? We're talking about marble bedrock. It only occurs in marble bedrock because marble bedrock supports a specific type of habitat, the early successional habitat that this species requires, and that's calcareous fens. We call them bog turtles, but really we should be calling them fen turtles. They don't live in bogs, they live in fens. And fens, calcareous ones, can only form atop of marble bedrock. And the marble bedrock only occurs in the extreme western portion of the state, and that's where this species occurs. So again, we're looking at that regional responsibility for the protection of a species, the marble bedrock and the bog turtle's distribution within the state. Just to give you a quick, now they're all extinct. No. If you look at all these dots, the ones that have the blue here, here, and here are the only 3 populations left in Connecticut. These are all now extirpated. There's none left. When we're talking about the number of bog turtles left in the state of Connecticut, we're talking about 3 populations that probably in total have about 60 to 70 turtles combined. 60 to 70. There might be more people in this room tonight than there are bog turtles in the wilds of Connecticut. So think about that when you're watching TV and looking at programs about elephants and rhinos and the conservation of those in Africa, when you can be watching programs like this one tonight where you guys all came about the conservation of bog turtles in your own backyard. Now, surficial geology. This is another one. This drives the distribution of species. We don't always think about things like this, but Connecticut used to be under a mile of ice, right? Surficial geology is really important. These are historic glacial lake beds. The distribution of a lot of species in Connecticut follows the actual distribution of these glacial lake beds. If we look at the eastern spadefoot, which is a type of toad, their stronghold is over here in Glacial Lake Plainfield in the extreme eastern part of the state within the Quinnebog River Valley. But they also occur elsewhere in the state, and I'm happy to say that this year we found a population in Enfield, so we do have a new extant population of this species in the central part of the valley, which is great. But everywhere that we have dots, look, Glacial Lake, Glacial Lake, Glacial Lake, Glacial Lake, Glacial Lake. If you're looking for this species and you live in Chester, are you going to find it? No, exactly, because there's no glacial lakes in Chester. It's restricted and distributed based on where the glacial lakes are in the state. So again, if you're a regulator and you're regulating a species that is distributed by the glacial lakes, such as potentially a blue-spotted salamander, you might want to be looking at where your glacial lakes are in the state of Connecticut, because that's where you're going to be finding them. And there are certain circumstances where you may have a watershed that is partly in a glacial lake and partly outside of a glacial lake, but hydrologically connected, where the blue spots may actually occur outside of the glacial lake realm, but it's still within the same hydrologically connected system. So be very critical in the review process of those types of systems. Elevation. I want to talk about a couple of things. How are we doing on time?
7:32.
Great. We have wanted to talk a little bit about some examples of example of elevation. So this is another driving factor when it comes to the distribution of species. If we look at the eastern box turtle, you'll notice that it's distributed primarily within the lowlands. In fact, most of the box turtle populations in the state of Connecticut are found at or below 500 feet in elevation. It's very rare to get them above 500 foot in elevation. We have a few populations spread out here and there, and those ones even are like in areas like Kent, where they're following up some of these lower river drainages and then going into the surrounding uplands a little bit, but they're tied to and associated greatly with elevation. We have species where you can flip this map and they're tied to elevations that are very high in the state of Connecticut. This just happens to be an example of one that's tied to a low elevation in Connecticut. So again, know where you are. If you're in the central part of the state, you are in the stronghold for this species in Connecticut and the conservation of this species. And this is a species that's not only restricted by elevation. Remember, this species is a habitat mosaic dependent species. And it's not an aquatic species of turtle. It's the only fully terrestrial species of turtle that we have in the state with some aquatic tendencies. That's really important. And why is that important in the regulatory realm? We don't protect terrestrial species. What? I didn't say it. That's the truth. There's going to be a lot of what's coming up very soon. But that's the fact. We do not protect them in any of our regulatory realms the way that we should be protecting them. We protect wetlands, and we protect what are considered upland review areas surrounding those wetlands, and within the purview of any local wetlands commission, they can only protect those wetlands, that 100, 200 feet, whatever it might be in that individual town, and the species that are considered aquatic and rely on those types of habitats surrounding the wetlands. The box turtle is not a wetland-dependent species. It is outside of the purview of any wetlands commission to protect it, okay? Okay, conservation. Slightly less than half of Connecticut's amphibians and reptiles depend upon a mosaic of habitats for their survival. Slightly less, okay? Of the 27 species that are uncommon or at their range edge in Connecticut, 17, so 63% of those species require habitat mosaics, 63% of them. 19 species with widespread distributions, of which 8, so 42% require habitat mosaics. So if we look at this, conserving habitat mosaics is, without a doubt, the largest conservation issue we face in Connecticut. It directly impacts the survivorship of no fewer than 25 of our amphibian and reptile species. Without adequately protecting habitat mosaics, we are putting at great risk no fewer than 25 species of amphibian and reptile in Connecticut. These slides are going to get a little bit wordy for a little bit. So, habitat fragmentation clearly illustrates the trajectory of listing species of conservation concern in Connecticut. So if we think about this in a time frame, between 1992, which was the inception of the state species listing process, and 2018, Connecticut experienced an 80% increase in the number of amphibians and reptiles that were considered of sufficiently high conservation concern to formally be listed as endangered, threatened, or special concern. One note on this, these are the 3 listing statuses species can get in Connecticut. You can either be endangered, you could be threatened, or you can be of special concern. If you are not endangered or threatened in the regulatory realm, you are not of a concern. That's just the way that it works. We do not afford protections very well for species that are only listed as special concern. But we do know that special concern species are rapidly declining across their ranges in Connecticut. Okay, rapidly declining. You might wonder, how did they break this down? And I kind of wonder about it too, and I wonder so much that I don't even know the exact numbers. But in order to be ranked as a endangered species, I believe you have to have less than 9 populations statewide, something like that. And then threatened is a number of populations that you have statewide. And then special concern is just you're declining statewide, okay? Such an increase in number in a period of time roughly corresponding to that between the publication of Bulletin 112, this book, right, and our current manuscript, this book, so 80% increase, demonstrates clearly that despite an abundance of species and locality data, we have not been able to get ahead of the ecological damage caused by the fragmentation curve. We have the data, we have the science, we have the knowledge. What's going wrong? Why are we going backwards, and why are we going backwards faster today than we were back in the 80s? Sprawl? That's part of it, yeah. We have, I should have put that slide up there. Less funding. Look at the state of Connecticut, the deep. Hardly any funding, hardly any staffing. No one can do permitting the way that they used to do. They've actually changed their permitting system to an automated system. This is mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. Less than 2 months ago, you used to have to submit an NDDB request that was reviewed by an actual biologist, a staff biologist at the state. That is not the case anymore. Now they have a computer that generates what is potentially at that site. And not only that, it generates an output of protection measures that should be followed if you're a developer to develop that property. That site rarely at this stage in the game gets a review by an actual biologist, let alone a consulting scientist that goes out and actually looks for these species. Because let's think about this map for a second. Let's go back. What does this dot even mean? It doesn't mean anything unless you're out there. That could be representative of one turtle. It could be representative of a population of 100 turtles. The protection of those two things are vastly different, vastly different. I can count on a single hand the number of populations of box turtles that we have, ranging over 50 individuals in the population. One hand. You might be looking at this map and be like, wow, look at all the dots for box turtles in Connecticut. They're doing fantastic. They're not. There's about 5 populations within these dots that are doing pretty well. The rest are still facing significant declines as a result of habitat fragmentation, road mortality, strikes by lawnmowers, things like that, and an inevitable decline in their populations, a long-term trajectory to extirpation, and that's what we're seeing here. It's not what these dots actually show, but that's the reality of what's happening. Told you this wasn't going to be happy. Oh, hang on. So, if you do like books about habitat fragmentation, if that's your thing, this book is awesome. It's legendary. It's by Johnson and Clemens, who's also Dr. Clemens, who co-authored this. The Nature and Fragments, The Legacy of Sprawl. Great book. Pick it up. Great, fantastic read if you like fragmentation. Weird plug. So if we look at development and habitat fragmentation, this is pretty much what we do, right? This is our landscape. This is what our landscape could look like and should look like. This is what it does look like. If we think about these species, say for example, we were just talking about a turtle. We'll just do a turtle, it's easy. We have a wood turtle that lives in this stream, right? Wood turtles are both aquatic and terrestrial. They spend the winter months in the river system where they hibernate, and in the early spring where they come out and they breed, right? So the males will breed with the females inside the stream, and then they'll both leave the streams and spend the majority of their time in just the uplands surrounding the river. Typically forested habitats, early successional habitats. They can be wetland or upland, floodplain habitats. It doesn't matter. It's usually within the first 300 feet of the stream that they spend the majority of their time. First 300 feet. 300 feet. That's it. 300 feet. We don't have regulations in the state that protect a species that only utilizes 300 feet from a stream. That's a problem. Now, that's just in the perfect scenario, in the perfect landscape, with the perfect mosaic of habitats. In this situation, that turtle would need to move much further to get to an early successional habitat to nest. Okay? Way, way over here. And they do move further distances if they need to. If the habitat needs are not met, they will move distances to meet those needs. Now, if we take, for example, a fragmented landscape, I should have gotten one potentially with a river in it, because I used a river. Pretend that this road is a river. We've now, we'll make some more pretend statements. This highway that we installed is now bisecting this turtle from its nesting grounds on the other side of it. Okay, simple example. This is happening all the time. This isn't like a new thing. All this development, you may think that this residential development isn't that big of an impact. It is an impact. It could have, it likely was, developed in some sort of early successional habitat because they're always easier to develop. You don't have to cut down a lot of trees. They tend to be more cost efficient and effective. So we're taking out early successional habitats. But not only that, in these habitats, we tend to get more actual strikes by lawnmowers and things like that when people are doing gardening to do work. Now, I worked on a project in Brookfield back in 2007 where we did a study on the eastern box turtle. And part of it was that the state had already designed and wanted to build a highway, about a mile and a half stretch of highway in the state of Connecticut. We tried to get them to eliminate all the work they would have had to done to protect species, to basically give millions of dollars to conservation and just buy a parcel of land that would have protected some stuff. But they refused to do that, so we ended up spending that money to do some pretty extreme conservation measures for these species. One of them was to put in a passage tunnel for turtles, which is huge. A passage, we have all sorts of barriers around the highway. The moral of this story is that we were able to protect 75 turtles, construct a highway, and not lose a single individual in 7 years as a result of building a highway that was then open to highway-type traffics. But we did have 3 turtles killed, all by lawnmowers, by adjacent urbanized landscapes within backyards. Just, moms and pops doing their lawn on the weekends, running our turtles over. That's how we lost the majority of our turtles at that project. So think about that. Yep.
So let's say we've developed a location and we want to step back and allow for some opportunity to have some defragmentation occur. Besides, say, so that bypasses the roadway, any other recommendations you have for these species?
I couldn't hear all of it. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
my apologies. Just to ask, so say we want to go ahead and allow for defragmentation to occur. We want these species to be able to connect to where they need to
Yeah,
go.
we want to eliminate fragmentation. In an already developed landscape, how can we do that?
Exactly.
There's ways to do that. There's ways to put in strategically passive structures, fences and barriers that prevent them from getting onto roadways, specialized products that will funnel them into the use of these areas. That's for hardscapes. The best thing is to avoid the impact from the beginning. But as we know in Connecticut, the impact's here. We need to work with it the best that we can. And this comes into play with something I'm going to talk about in just a little bit when we talk about a town's plan of conservation and development and the need to have an NRA, which is a natural resource, NRI, a natural resource inventory. Without a natural resource inventory, you don't know the critical areas within your town that need to be protected. And that's what we're going to get into. And some of the areas within your town, which may be fragmented now, but think 100 years from now, 200 years from now. Things change. They change every day. Look at how much things have changed in 20 years in Connecticut. There's always the chance that things can go back and some of these things can rebound if given the opportunity through, really creative land planning and management practices. So this is just an example of habitat fragmentation. Clearly, if you were a turtle, you would want to live here and not here. But remember, turtles can't fly, so they don't have a choice. That wasn't a dig against the birds. I know there's a bird in here watching me all night. Let's get a sense, though. I think we kind of lose a sense of how much habitat some of these species actually use in a year. We talked a little bit about the vernal pool breeding species in the beginning, but let's look at this. How far do some of these amphibians actually travel from these breeding pools? Well, if we take, for example, the spotted salamander, that's been documented traveling up to 817 feet. 817 feet. They've probably moved a lot more than that, or a bit more than that. And remember, that is the furthest they've been documented. So most of them aren't moving that far. But just think about that. A tiny little salamander moving 817 feet from a vernal pool, that's a long way. Think about a blue spotted salamander, 1,165 feet potentially from the edge of a pool. Think about a wood frog, 3,018 feet potentially from the edge of a vernal pool. Think about this pool, these distances, and the level of fragmentation that can occur within this upland area that, remember, is not regulated because we regulate wetlands and not the surrounding uplands unless it's the upland review area. That's a lot of potential impact, right? Do you guys see where I'm going with this? All right, so wetland and upland disconnections. There is no better example of how regulations can simultaneously help and hurt ecosystems than the challenges presented by regulations of wetlands. And that the challenges presented by regulation of wetlands that depend on adjacent unregulated uplands, okay? So while wetland regulations and local wetland agencies recognize the upland wetland buffers are important in maintaining the purity of water that enters wetland systems, they treat each wetland on the landscape as a discrete regulatory unit. We need to get away from this thinking. Species with complex habitat uses often require uses that require overland movements between a diversity of wetland types and habitat types are ignored within the current land use regulatory system. Completely ignored. Even if each of the wetlands on the landscape is protected with an undisturbed, intact 100-foot forested buffer, vulnerability still remains for many of these habitat mosaic species, for example, spotted turtle and many other species that utilize multiple habitat types on a large landscape scale. Does that make sense to everyone? Good. Yes. 5 minutes? Oh, I thought you had a question. Uh-oh. So, the conservation issue of these species, that is, they must transverse portions of the habitat mosaic that are not protected by any regulatory framework. All right, so I misjudged this a little bit, but let's jump a little bit, we'll jump a little bit. This is regional planning, okay? This is what we need to be doing. This is the Farmington River Biodiversity Study I was talking to you guys about, where we identified primary conservation areas, secondary conservation areas, and areas within these systems, these towns, that could potentially serve as inter-conservation area connections. And that's what you were talking about a little bit. These are all areas where potentially we can implement strategies moving forward to reconnect some of these already fragmented landscapes. But it's important to understand these are the intact or areas within each of these towns that can potentially be reconnected to the greatest degree possible. These are also the areas where the highest biodiversity was indicated within these various towns. So this is an important tool, and each town should be incorporating some sort of natural resource inventory into their plan of conservation and development, and they should be working with their wetland commissions and zoning and planning commissions to make sure that these various activities are enforced within their permitting process. They have the power to do this. You change your plan of conservation and development. Every 10 years it can be updated. The people of town have the power to implement what they want to implement in their very town. Some towns choose to have 100-foot wetland upland review areas. Some choose to have 300. Every town can have 300 if they want. Towns can have 600 if you want. You can put whatever you want in. But it's up to the town. It's up to the individuals in the town, and it's up to you as citizens as to how you want to see the landscape that you live in protected into the future. It's your responsibility. Don't blame the developers, blame yourselves. Stop blaming the developers. It's not fair, because they're doing everything they're supposed to be doing. Energy and telecommunications. This is how stuff is permitted in Connecticut. We're going to go real quick. Energy and telecommunications, the Connecticut Siting Council, that's state and federal lands. Anything that is on state or federal lands or with state or federal funding, federal and state permitting, okay? Private projects greater than 5 acres in size, state, but primarily local permitting, okay? The state doesn't have any jurisdiction over you towns. You do it yourselves. Private projects less than 5 acres in town, the state doesn't even know about it. It's all done within the town and the wetlands commissions and the planning and zoning commissions, okay? This was gonna be a fun part. So, the NDDB, what is this? This is the Natural Diversity Database. And I think I have to stop here, unfortunately. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah.
All right, I'll keep going. Development is greater than 5 acres in size requires a general stormwater permit, okay? So the DEEP, this is how it works. The DEEP will issue a preliminary determination letter. This will describe all the listed species known to occur on that proposed parcel, okay? Known. Doesn't mean it's all of them, it's all the known ones. If that parcel has never been surveyed by a scientist, your letter might come back with no listed species identified. What you're supposed to be doing as a responsible developer is going out and hiring a reputable environmental consultant that will go out and survey the property, delineate the wetlands, actually survey for all the listed species, and develop protection and management plans for those species as they see fit based on the impacts of the development, okay? That's not usually happening. Developers hire these consultants to ensure there is no impact. The developer or the consultant will write a report. The developer will submit that to the DEEP for review. The DEEP will approve that submittal, right, if they see it fit, and issue a final determination letter. And it's off to the races. The only permitting process, and this does not involve wildlife, this involves the fact that they need a general stormwater permit because their development is greater than 5 acres in size. So this letter is submitted as part of the general stormwater permit application process, and it only takes into account the recommendations from the environmental scientists on how to protect these wetland-dependent species, because they're actually more interested in protecting the actual water itself, not the species that are utilizing it. Okay? I'm a developer. Whether you like me or not, let's take a walk through the permitting process. This is my parcel of land. I own it. I'm a private property owner. You can't dictate what I do on my land. That's a problem we have in here, Connecticut. It's not an issue that we can't get around. It's an issue that we need to change as a society as a whole and start to value land in a different way. We only value land for what it's worth according to how much that sale value is. What about how valuable this land is based on the species that are on this property? That's not something that we look at as a society as a whole right now. We need an actual shift in our thinking and where we put things that are important to us. This isn't just important because it might have a few turtles in it. It's important for environmental health. It's important for mental health. Green areas are important for both the environment, environmental health, water quality, air quality, all sorts of things, and mental health. When I was a kid, I was able to go anywhere I want. I feel really bad for these kids today because everywhere you go, there's a no trespassing sign. You're not allowed to go anywhere anymore. And that's a big problem. That's a big shift in how I grew up versus how kids are growing up in this day and age, and how they're influenced by nature and how they see nature and how they respect it. They're not allowed to see it or respect it anymore. We don't allow that anymore. We've taken that away. So we need to get that back. Think about that. Again, I'm a developer. Here we go. I was just told that box turtles occur there and Jefferson salamanders occur there. I'm going to be a good developer. I'm going to go out there, delineate my wetlands. I found some vernal pools. Not only that, but I actually found some Jefferson salamander egg masses in them. Okay? I went back later in the season, in August, do a box turtle survey. I didn't see any box turtles in this property. Didn't see any. They weren't there, so there's no box turtles there. Any problems with that? What's the problem? I looked for them.
They're sleeping.
No, in August? No, they're up and about. They're moving. Oh, I'll make it a little easier. I went back out in June and didn't find them. Where were they? They were in the forest. They hibernate in the forest. It's June. It's the height of the year. It's the breeding season. They were over here in the early successional habitat laying their eggs. And the males were over there too, chasing the females. They were in the forest where I was looking. Why would they be there? That's where they're coming in October. So I sent my consultant out in August to make sure they didn't find them.
Nice.
But we looked. That's all that matters. We looked. And then I submit my development. And I look like a hero because I didn't find any box turtles. Had I, would have probably done some management for them, but because I didn't find them, I didn't need to. But I did put up silt fence to prevent them from getting into the active construction area during the development process. And I gave all of our vernal pools 100-foot buffers to protect them. 100% legit, permittable subdivision here in the state of Connecticut as we stand right now. This is it. That's how we protect animals. That's the process. If you don't like it, it's in your court to change it. I deal with developers on a daily basis. I deal with conservation organizations on a daily basis. I deal with the angry public on a daily basis. I deal with people who are angry because there's a development going in close to them. I call them the NIMBYs. I don't like them, and I'll tell you why I don't like them. I don't like them because they use and weaponize resources within the environment to prevent a development going into their viewscape, and I don't think that that's appropriate. I think that ultimately that causes greater impacts to the conservation of species down the line because developers get tired of hearing it. If we are honest, if we do the surveys, collect the scientific data, and allow those data to guide our decision making processes, we could do much better as a community and as a state as a whole. That's the bottom line. We all need to come together, and I've worked with developers for years. I'm friends with many of them. I've changed many of their views on how they develop, so my employees can witness them. We don't change them all, do we? But we do make a difference. It does happen, and developers are willing to give quite a bit of money and land to conservation when they're approached in a very specific and way that's like you're not attacking them. Our system right now is a set up to attack. Scientists against scientists to attack developers. Guide the science. Let the science do the work. That's what it's there for. And that essentially concludes the presentation. So, thank you guys. If you guys didn't want the book, thank you. If you guys did want the book, it's available online at the Deep Bookstore. I don't remember how much it is, $54 or something like that. Or you can get it at Sessions. But I think you have to buy it with a check at Sessions. Great book for conservation and what needs to be done. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'll take some questions. 15 minutes for questions? Go ahead. You can. I think we're doing a petting turtle session after this, right? So I think there's time for that in just a little bit. I don't know the turtle's name. My turtle at home is named Eileen because she's missing a leg and she leans when she walks. Go ahead.
Is there any conservation recommendations you've had for young ones that they
Like in their backyards? Absolutely. There's always, every little thing can make a difference. And parents may not want to hear this, but kids, convince your parents not to rake up leaves in the fall. They're very important. They're important for the insects and the insects community. And think about this. It's a natural fertilizer for your lawn. Why are you raking it up and getting rid of it? Then you have to come back and refertilize in the spring, and that's a waste of time and money. Leave your leaves. There's no reason to get rid of them. Reduce the amount of mowing, things like that in your backyards. There's books about backyard scapes and how to actually landscape your yard to make it more appropriate and wildlife friendly. There's tons of stuff on that. There was a question here, yes.
Dennis, does a vernal pool definition, is it by the spring high water that would put the boundary? Would it change depending on the type of species in the vernal pool?
Spring high water doesn't change based on the type of species. There has to be an obligate species for a vernal pool. So spotted turtle, salamander, marbled salamander, Jefferson salamander, wood frog, any of those. The number of them would make the pool a higher quality pool versus one that only sustained one species versus one that sustained 3 or 4 species. That would be a higher quality pool. But it is based on the spring water, high water mark when it comes to regulatory issues.
And when you flag those, is that typically then surveyed in to get that where that location is so that that's where your boundary would be?
Depending on the town and the town's regulations, you're supposed to, by state regulations, you have to have a certified soil scientist or wetland scientist, someone who's actually approved to do this type of work. You can't just have anybody go out there and survey a wetland and flag or delineate a wetland. But you could do it in multiple ways when you do it. You could actually do it by maps. You don't have to be in the field depending on various towns' regulations. The real way you should be doing it is in the field, and that's typically how it's done. And it's done not just with looking at water levels, it's done with an auger and looking at soil profiles primarily in Connecticut. So you're looking at the soil profile and basing the level of iron and oxidation rates within that soil column to base where the actual edge of the wetland falls during the high water mark in the spring. So it's very scientifically based, how to actually identify the edge of a wetland in Connecticut. I'm a sort of certified soil scientist, and it works. I hate doing it, but I'll be honest, I don't do it really. Go ahead. Yes?
Mark, could you make your leaves after fall?
Like after the winter comes, you can, but the thing is that a lot, like when you have like leaves and things like that, if you're gonna rake them into your woods, somewhere where the animals can use them, because leaves, believe it or not, You know, they protect everything that's in the soil from the cold environment. So when it snows or when it rains, these leaves will actually make the soil conditions below them much warmer and much more suitable for the organisms that are relying on that soil. So if you remove your leaves, you have drying conditions, and you end up making the soils more cold in the winter months, which makes it harder for a lot of these insect species to survive the winters as a result of that. So leaves are a buffer from the environment. So you don't have to rake leaves this weekend. You tell your parents Dennis said it was not a good thing to do, and they can give me a call. Question.
So if you have a turtle that's crossing the road and you want to help it, I've heard that you should just continue it in the path it was going. But what if, and I live near a golf course, it was heading right to the golf course. There's nothing else there, would probably get chopped up by the mower. Should I turn it around?
Unpopular opinion coming in 3, 2, 1. Moving turtles across the road is what I refer to as feel-good science. I'm not telling anyone not to do it. Do it. It doesn't matter. Because you're not always there. You're not following that turtle around. That turtle could have turned right back around and 3 hours later got hit by a car. It's not sustainable. Okay? Turtles survive on their own in landscapes that allow them to survive. What we need to do is prevent these situations where they run into high mortality events within the landscape. Now, as far as your question goes, it depends on what time of year it is. If you were moving that turtle in June, I would say you probably should have moved it to the actual golf course, because it was probably going into one of the sand dunes to lay eggs. That's what they do. If it was a snapping turtle in August, it could have been going into one of the golf course ponds to hibernate. It's very difficult to know what a turtle's doing and where to move it. People always say, well, move it in the direction it's going. That's always a good idea, but was the turtle going that direction 5 minutes ago when it saw a car come by at 65 miles an hour? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it was going in the other direction. It's a guessing game, and it's not sustainable biology, and it certainly is not anything that we should be promoting as conservation. It's feel-good biology. Don't stop doing it, but it is not a way to sustain populations of turtles for the long term in Connecticut. Every turtle you see on the road is essentially going to be a dead turtle on the road. That's a fact.
We've had a lot of development in Cheshire of late. Yeah. And one of the problems was with development so close to vernal pools, high-quality vernal pools, and the distance from the property to the vernal pool was like 75 feet or something like that. I think if I heard you correctly, you said those kind of things could have been addressed during our plan of conservation, which are done every 10 years, and was just completed in both Southbury and Cheshire with no references to those kind of things.
You don't have an upland review area?
Pardon me?
You don't have an upland review area? You have to within your town. What's in your wetlands? What is your upland review area?
I don't know. Ours is 150.
That's good. 150 is a good. Well, it's not good, but it's in general it's good.
Is it 100? Is it 200?
100 is pretty common. 125, 150, 200. The highest I've seen is 200, I think.
How do we change that? If the plan of conservation is when you lay out those kind of things, how do we didn't know that when we were working on Southbury's. We just a bunch of people in the different nonprofits.
The town has to be, for one, the town has to be politically motivated to change it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one thing. In a town like Southbury, I hate to say it, is not politically motivated to change regulations like that. They're not going to be sensitive to conservation. They're going to be more sensitive to beautiful homes coming in, bringing in tax revenue, things like that. Southbury is a very difficult town to work in. A lot of towns are, but
So since that 10-year window is done, since it's done, it just was completed in both towns, how do we possibly do something?
you have to see if there's a process within your wetland regulations that allows some sort of a change in the actual statute within the town that will allow that to happen. I don't know the town's regulations, but you look at that, talk to the commissioner, and see. The other thing is talk with the first selectman or mayor of the town and get. You said you're in Roxbury?
Southbury.
Southbury.
And Cheshire.
Southbury and Cheshire. I don't know either of them in Cheshire. Some of them wasn't Roxbury. But talk to the people who are making the decisions. Talk to the Planning and Zoning Commission. The key is that they have to want this. If they don't want it, it's not going to happen. That's the reality of it. That's where we really run into the biggest issues and the biggest problems. Towns have to want it. So for example, Salisbury loves this. Salisbury's like revising things like 300 feet plus. I think they're even proposing 600 feet right now. That's because most of the people in Salisbury don't want neighbors. They don't want to look at their neighbors. So it's actually very convenient to have these very strict permitting regulations. But in a town like Cheshire, which has very little open space left that's open for development, you're really pinching private landowners and restricting their ability to develop with very strict conservation and management plans. It's a balancing act for sure, and you need to get community support and, of course, support of your local commissions and regulators. Any more questions? Yeah.
How do we get to a place where, when those subdivisions do go in, that people are using less road salt on their sidewalks and driveways?
Stuff like that is much more easy. That is during the actual permitting process of it. So you can put in special environmental conditions that say no road salt use. I mean, I've had projects that have recently gone in, you can't use road salts, period. They can't be used at all. The other thing is, like, every little thing counts when it comes to a development. So for example, a lot of towns are putting in like these square curbs, like the old school squared off. Stop putting those in. Put in Cape Cod curbing, which allows salamanders to migrate and move over those curbing structures instead of getting immediately directed into catch basins and things like that. So those little tiny subtleties that you can create within a development, even if you don't like the development as a whole, that are more environmentally friendly than just doing it the old way. There's new ways to do things. But things like reduced salt or no salt, very common. There's one that just went through where neighbors aren't allowed to use pesticides or herbicides or anything like that on their properties. And when you have such regulations deeded in to the property on the actual town deeds, land deeds, you have to follow those regulations. Now, the question is, how do you in 20 years from now, who's going to go back into Bob's backyard and make sure he's not spreading pesticides? It's always the enforcement issue that really catches up to you in the end. But the ability and the avenue to put those in is there, and you can use them today.
But they're actually using no salt regulations to protect vernal pools or the drinking water supply?
You could do that for anything. You could do that for
Where is
anything.
it happening?
Where is that happening? What town what project was that? Oh gosh, I got so many. I can't remember exactly which one. Was that Oxford? Oxford is a no spray zone, no salt zone. I did it with, actually a big one that I did was with Amtrak. So New Haven, Hartford, Springfield's high-speed line, I worked on that project. And one of the things that they used to do is they used to go up and down these tracks with a rail cart that would just high-velocity spray pesticides into everything, because you can't have trees and stuff and vegetation along your rail lines. It's not safe for passengers to travel. And then I came in. Now, it's still safe, but they have to now not spray. It's no spray off the cart adjacent to wetlands. So tens of miles, that sounds weird, where they had to change their actual spraying protocols. And I'm not saying they can't spray. They can't broadcast spray now. So you don't have these toxins going into a wetland 50 feet past the rail bed. They have to go by hand now and do it. So in these areas that are specialized and I've identified as being specialized wetlands for amphibians and reptiles and just for drinking water in general, you have to be more strategic on how you're spraying and using these toxins. Has anyone ever been behind a DOT truck spraying? It's a great experience. I highly recommend it. Happened to me this past summer. I couldn't believe the amount of toxins coming out of this truck. It was unbelievable. Just to kill weeds on the side of the highway. We do know that they sell grasses that only grow this tall, that you don't need to cut. No mow lawns. You could do that. Well, the reason why we still don't do that in Connecticut is because it's someone's job, and you don't want to take someone's job away. But there's really no reason that we have to maintain our center medians within our highways the way that we do. There's plenty of ways that nature does that on its own, but we prefer not to allow that to happen because it's not a way to pay people. Nature doesn't pay in that way. Nature pays in a different way. Any other questions? Yep.
One more question. It's my understanding that for the wetland commissioners that they are limited on what they can enforce in the upland review when it comes to species, unless it can be demonstrated that that impact of the species would have a negative impact on the actual wetland portion.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of that?
With a species that isn't an obligate wetland species, I cannot. I think one of the biggest cases was the protection of the upland review area for the wood frog, where it was demonstrated that the wood frog actually is a cycling species, which improves the nutrient dispersal within the surrounding forest because the larvae eat all of the decaying leaf litter, and as they metamorphose, they bring all of that nutrient back into the surrounding forest. So that was one of the biggest ties that we had between a wetland and a terrestrial species, and that interconnect between how these two systems are functioning. It's the same thing when you think about black grizzly bears eating the salmon up in Alaska. They're another terrestrial species that distributes nutrients throughout the ecosystem because they're bringing and not feeding a lot of those fishes that they actually kill, and they bring them into the woods, which spreads the nutrients throughout the system. I don't know if we have any more time, but I'll take more questions if we do.
Well, so the critical terrestrial habitat of, say, a wood frog, in your opinion, I think in your book, you have it at something like upwards of 500, you know, and so about 100-foot vernal pool envelope is probably
That doesn't do anything.
deleterious for
Yeah.
the life of the.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. I don't want to like really talk down upon a 100-foot buffer because a 100-foot buffer, we need to understand it in the way that it functions. It's important for when adults are coming in, they stage in that area, and it's critically important for when metamorphs are coming out because as they're leaving the vernal pool, they spend a lot of time in that first 100 feet. And then they disperse out into the greater forested complex beyond that. But 100 feet gets you nowhere long-term, nowhere.
We had testimony that a wood frog would relocate up to half a mile. That's one of the reasons. And in this Scott Swamp area.
Yeah.
Do you believe that that's true?
Yeah.
A very small percentage of the population will do that. You're protecting, I forget exactly what the numbers are, but once you implement that 750, I think it's upwards of 90% of the population is technically protected because the majority of the population is using that first 750 feet with the oddballs moving further from.
I mean, 750 would be amazing.
It should not be amazing. It should be regulatory. That would make a big difference.
True oversight or deep regulations with any teeth as by the commission, wouldn't it be wonderful for scientists like you if there were some 10 or 15 point program that you would prescribe that people like us could lobby or petition our land use municipal agencies to adopt at our next POCD, something that, for example, like what you just said, that the appropriate time to survey wouldn't be in June when the box turtles aren't going to be found, and just things like that seem very ethical. Should is there anything like that in the book? I didn't, you know.
Oh yeah, the book covers everything. It doesn't really get into surveying and stuff like that, but you know, I do a lot of talks for wetlands commissions to help them better understand surveying methodologies and techniques and timing of those surveys, what to look for if you have a reputable survey versus one that's not. If you're out in the eastern part of the state and you're doing vernal pool surveys for diploid blue spotted salamanders and you go out and you're doing egg mass counts, that's voided. They don't lay masses of eggs. They lay eggs singly, so you can't detect them through those methodologies. You only can detect them through trapping methodologies.
They found 7 spotted salamander rafts, and they were poo-pooed because they felt that, and now especially they're going to be, which Carol so loved testified to with this particular development, they're going to be stranded for sure. But that doesn't obviate the fact that they are part of the vernal pool. And
also they're going to be impacted by secondary impacts, you know, changes in hydrology from the development, changes in pesticide or runoffs from development. Everyone's going to be planting gardens and having lawns, putting ice or down on their driveways, oil coming out of their cars, things like that. These all get into the groundwater and eventually get into the vernal pools in themselves, just from surface runoff, groundwater. It all gets there eventually. It all causes an impact eventually. Yeah. Any other questions?
Millions.
Yeah, we're seeking to preserve more land. There's a lot of money available for open space grants. Now, how do we get the documentation that these species exist on some of these?
If you have money to buy a parcel of land, you call me, I'll come out and do the work personally for you. free of charge. It's very rare that we get work where we can actually do what we love doing and the outcome not be a development. I work at highly reduced rates for conservation organizations and for organizations that actually have the money to purchase parcels but haven't had the resources to do the surveys. I do them myself. It takes me literally a half a day to 2 days to tell you everything that could potentially be there and where it is and how to protect it. It's very simple. It's not complicated. We just make it complicated.
I think these species in this particular beautiful 87 wooded wetland vertical acreage, it was grossly understated what's living in there.
Oh, probably, yeah. Usually is, yeah. I mean, if minnow traps weren't used, there's no way blue spots would have been documented in a complex system like that. I mean, blue spots, when they're in these riparian systems, tend to stick within the riparian system. They will use traditional vernal pools in the upland surrounding the riparian system, but if you're not trapping that riparian system, you're more than likely missing them. That's just a basic survey methodology for that species. You have to survey for them differently than you do for a species like a Jefferson salamander or a spotted salamander or a marbled salamander. They use the environment differently than those species. So you have to know how to survey for them. And even then, surveying for them can be very difficult. These systems are vast, they're big, they're hard to trap. You know, they might be breeding only in a very small specific area within that pond or that pool. You can very easily miss them. You need a pretty robust trapping effort to actually document the presence of this species, that species within a landscape.
And there are, as you say, to measure the vernal pool requires augers, and it's a scientific, it's not kind of by the seat of your pants, as happened, I think, here, when they, and I don't know if that could be something that. Well, I think it was one of the experts, Connecticut Rivers Alliance person who took the time to read the record, thought it was woefully delineated. It was just really
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't read the record. I don't know. But it should be in the record how it was done for sure. And it should have been done through a combination of methodologies. But that primary methodology should have been looking at the high water mark and using augers to look at the actual soils types themselves.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, everyone.
Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Andrew Lynn.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Veterans Corner. My name's Chuck Wooden.
Decision for ourselves for this week, if we want to be made well.
Hi, welcome to the crack of dawn. It's Dawn Lombardi. I'm starting the painting. It's going to be the cliffs with some water. Love it.
He took me on the sets of Lost in Space, Batman.
Everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time.